Hi, my name's Phil Bicknell, and I lead AHDB's market intelligence work from what's happening at the farm level right through to what's happening in retail and food service market. Welcome to today's webinar. We're going to look at leaving the EU and the change that is coming and explore some of the issues that it means for your business. Now, it's probably an understatement to say that we live in uncertain times, but the UK's Brexit transition period, well, that's about to come to an end. We're in the final few weeks of that before it finishes at the end of the year. That means there's a lot of change coming for agriculture and for horticulture. Now, as it stands right now, there are lots of aspects that I think are still uncertain, that are still a bit up in the air. We're going to cover some of those issues as we go through the webinar today. We know that the relationship with Europe, for instance, with the EU, that's one of the key aspects where there's still a lack of clarity. So even with that in mind, we're still going to think about some of the important things, cover some of the big topics that we think farm businesses need to consider and be thinking about. We'll also flag some of the issues that remain unresolved and give our take in terms of what happens in future. Now, from my perspective, look, making change in uncertain times is a real challenge, and I think it's natural to take a wait and see approach. And certainly in agriculture, where we deal with long production cycles, that's somewhat inevitable. And I think it's understandable when a storm approaches, it's only natural to batten down the hatches and wait for things to return to normal. However, it feels like the changes that are coming are more than a blip. It feels like the storm won't just pass over. It doesn't feel like riding out the storm is the best approach. It's much more about how we adapt and evolve to a new normal. So over the next 90 minutes or so, we're going to look at how exiting the EU impacts 5 different aspects. We're going to look at policy. We're going to look at some of the markets and trade issues. We're going to explore as well what it means in relation to aspects like inputs and suppliers. We're going to take a look at our farm finances. And finally, we're going to pick up some of the labour implications as well. You'll be glad to know it's not just me talking. I'm going to hand over to colleagues to pick up these 5 different aspects as we go through the webinar. So to kick off, the first area we're going to look at is going to be around agricultural policy. We know that there's key changes are coming down the pipeline in terms of agricultural support, not least because yesterday we saw the agriculture bill become law. Now the details are still to be confirmed, and I think as farmers we're all hungry for that information, but the legislation is there. So to pick this up, I'll hand over to Sarah Baker for a few minutes. Sarah leads our work on trade and policy analysis, so she's the expert to take us through what we can expect in terms of policy. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you, Phil, and welcome. So as Phil said, I'm here today to take you through the changes in agricultural policy in the UK. But first, I just want to take you through a quick overview of what's been happening over the last 12 months and what's currently going on in Brussels. So the second phase, the trade negotiation, if you like, we left the EU at the end of 2019. We've been in this 12-month transition period, and that will conclude at 11 p.m. on the 31st of December. It's been well documented in the news what's been happening, but just of late things have gone fairly quiet. So I just wanted to give you a quick update on what we know from our Brussels colleagues. We know that last weekend the PM spoke to the President of the European Commission, and both sides have agreed that progress has been made, but fisheries and level playing fields remain these sticking points. On the 19th of November, the European Council have a pre-booked meeting, and Brexit is not on the agenda, but there's speculation that that date could be the turning point. That date could be the day at which it's agreed to continue the talks or to ramp up the no deal preparations. But at the moment, neither side wants to be the first to walk away from the negotiations or to give up on them, because nobody wants to take the blame, if you like, for failing to reach an agreement on trade. So the pressing time is the real lack of time for ratification. We were given the 31st of October as a very clear deadline to allow time for ratification. Clearly that has come and gone, but the European Parliament timetable was based on agreement at the end of this week, so clearly now that needs to be rescheduled. So still a great deal of uncertainty. I think the mood in Brussels at the moment is rather pessimistic. The mood here in the UK, with things having gone quiet, it is rather more optimistic. So at the moment, it's really impossible to call. It could go either way. So still a huge amount of uncertainty hanging over those trade negotiations. So let's focus back in on what we do know. Next slide, please. Now, in England, the agricultural policy, we have some detail around the environmental land management schemes. We have a timetable for reduction, which is a 7-year timetable. So reductions in direct payments are going to start next year, and we've been given the first year of reduction. So the first 30,000 loses 5%, 30 and 50, 10, 50 to 150, 20, and 150 and above 25. So a bit like income tax, it's on a sort of a sliding scale. What we don't know at the moment is the reductions beyond 2021. But having the news that the agricultural bill has been given royal assent, so it has passed into law, I would imagine an announcement on further details about the reduction of elms and detail around the other schemes associated with elms to be made very soon. So I would watch this space. What we also know is that the current agri-environmental schemes will continue until the end of 2024. They're the countryside stewardship and the higher level stewardship. And at the same time, alongside those, the test and trial phase of ELM is already currently underway and will continue next year. And the national pilot, that the sign up for national pilot will be open from the beginning of 2021 while those schemes are tested and trialled. And then from 2024, the environmental land management contracts will be rolled out nationally. It doesn't mean that tests and trials will stop after 2024. There'll still be a feedback loop to see what's working and what's not working and what can be improved. But that is the timetable for the formal rollout at the end of 2024. Next slide, please. So what does environmental land management policy look like in England? Well, it's really built on this public goods, and a public goods in economic terms is a good that is not really dealt with very well in the market. So farmers are providing these public goods at the moment, the protecting the waterways, clean air, clean water, management of the farmland and woodland, management of the soils, but they don't necessarily get a direct reward for that type of investment. So this is intended to address that market failure. And examples of public goods that have been stated in the environmental land management scheme are the managing of land and water in a way that protects or improves the environment, public access to the countryside, mitigating or adapting to climate change. As we all know, that's one of the biggest threats facing our industry and indeed globally at the moment, preventing, reducing or protecting from environmental hazards, and protecting and improving the health and welfare of livestock, the health of plants, and other areas of funding. There's going to be a huge focus on productivity. There's going to be a very clear research and development programme, and there's going to be support for farmers during this transition. And by this transition, I mean the 7-year transition from direct payments into ELM. Next slide, please. Now, obviously, as I said, the ELM scheme only covers England. Agricultural policy is a devolved responsibility, and therefore in Scotland, agricultural policy will differ as it does in Wales. In Scotland, the publication is stability and simplicity, and they're minimising changes from the common agricultural policy at the moment. And the transition period up until 2024 will have very, very small changes. So they won't see those reductions in direct payments straight away. And beyond 2024, a new policy period will start. But at the moment, we don't have a great deal more detail around that policy. Next slide. Equally in Wales, they have the Sustainable Farming Scheme, and their payments are intended to reward farmers for delivering sustainable land management. So along similar themes to the public goods, so restoring biodiversity and so on. And again, there'll be a transition period to help farmers prepare. Payments will be made annually, but they'll be agreed in multi-annual contracts. Next slide, please. So here in England, what does the introduction of ELMS mean? Well, to sort of set the scene, I'd like to look at the importance of direct payments by sector. And as you can see from this slide in the dark green, the importance of direct payments, particularly in the grazing livestock industry, it's incredibly important for the average farm business. And I know we have a huge variation in farm performance, so an average is exactly that. But we can see in many cases it makes up the bulk of farm business income for many businesses out there. And in general cropping and cereals, it's also incredibly important. So to lose that that amount of money, if you like, over a period of 7 years has incredibly important implications for farm businesses. Well, at the moment, the overall pot of money for ELM has been guaranteed at the same level as direct payments. But what we do know already, and I'll talk a little bit about this as I go forward, is that pot may be spread more widely, i.e. that pot might not be earmarked just for farmers. It could be spread over all land managers. And beyond 2024, beyond the end of the next parliamentary period, we don't know how much money will be made available. And being realistic as an economist and knowing the challenges that COVID has placed on the economy and the national finances, I think it would be prudent to expect the overall level of payment to be less generous than direct payments. Next slide, please. So the other thing we know about environmental land management schemes is that they're going to be in 3 tiers. So tier 1 is the entry level scheme. This is for all farmers to employ or continue practices. And it's been made very clear that any farmers that are currently in environmental land management schemes are not going to be disadvantaged by this transition to ELM. And that would suggest that the more you can participate in these schemes at the moment, or the more your level of expertise in higher level stewardship schemes, you will be well placed to enter into this tier 1 farm level type scheme. And they will be individual to businesses, planting cover crops, wildflower meadows, things that individual farmers can do on their farm. Now the tier 2, the local level, will require collaboration, and the type of scheme that this may encompass are things like the nitrate vulnerable zones, where you're collaborating with other farmers into a catchment protection. So it'll be a sort of a group scheme, and that might require some sort of expert advice or input into that collaboration and managing that scheme. And then the tier 3 are the sort of countryside landscape level schemes that contribute to national commitments around net zero, carbon storage, and they will be the major schemes around afforestation and peatland restoration, that sort of huge scale scheme. Now, farm tier 1, we understand, will be open to farmers. Tier 2 and tier 3 will by their nature be open to all land managers. We don't yet know the allocation of funds between the different tiers, but as I say, I would expect an announcement around ELMS very soon, probably by the end of this month. So I would be looking very closely and making sure that you're fully informed with all changes. The other thing to say is that going back to the importance of direct payments in your current income, we will provide tools for you on the AHDB website that will enable you to calculate exactly what that tiered reduction in direct payments will look like for your farm business going forward. Next slide, please. Okay, so that was a very rushed run through the environmental land management schemes. As I say, there's an awful lot we don't know about it at the moment. There are some basic facts there that I've put in front of you, what we do know. What we do know is direct payments are going. And we do know that businesses need to prepare for that loss of income. And therefore, as I said, there will be a tool on the website available, which will be updated as soon as more information is made available on exactly what that loss of direct payments will look like for your business. We also know that negotiators are still talking to each other, but we know that time is extremely short. And for that reason, I think it's prudent to get ready, prepare for the worst, but hope for the best. Whatever happens, change is coming. So the policy changes are going to be regardless of whether a deal with the EU is struck or not struck. It has more impact on our trade situation, which my colleague will be taking you through next. But after the transition, the UK will be out of the single market and the customs union, and there'll be unavoidable changes in the way we trade, and there'll be unavoidable changes in domestic policy. A trade deal is still preferable, as my colleague again will take you through at the moment, in order to remain competitive, and it's important for the implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol. But what we do know is that change is coming, and it's really important that we prepare for that change now. As Phil alluded to earlier, doing nothing or waiting and see is a high risk strategy. Thank you very much.
Great. Many thanks, Sarah. We're going to come to inputs and finances and labour a little bit later on, but we're going to move straight on with David Swales, who's going to say a little bit about the marketplace and some of the things that we can anticipate there, particularly kind of talking about some of the tariffs. David heads up our strategic insight work. So, David, over to you.
Thank you, Phil. So yeah, interesting. This was the sort of top area, or the biggest question mark from the poll, and I can well understand why, because we still do have this uncertainty around whether there is or isn't going to be a trade deal with the EU. So hopefully today I can give you a little bit of clarity about what both of those options might look like and what their impact on the marketplace and on the commodities you deal with might be. This is certainly something which at AHDB we've been looking at very closely over the last few years. So I guess the key point here is that there is definitely going to be change on the 1st of January. We've obviously been sheltered a little bit from some of the full impacts of Brexit because of this transition period we've been under. But the UK government has been quite firm in its commitment to leave the single market and customs union on the 31st of December. So that will mean whether or not we have a deal, that there will be a new set of rules and regulations and customs checks which happen at our borders. And that will add some cost to the trade between ourselves and the EU, which will impact the marketplace. But of course, we do have a whole set of other issues which we need to think about in the event that there is no trade deal with the EU. So in that eventuality, we will find ourselves trading under these infamous WTO, World Trade Organization rules, and we will have to deal with tariffs. And the tariffs, as we'll see on the next slide, between ourselves and the EU will be pretty high. If we can move to the next slide, please. So this is a very, very simplified take, and I think it's fair to say the sort of tariff arrangements for agriculture are probably more complex than any other sector. So there's a whole mass of different tariff lines for a whole range of different products and different cuts of meat and so on and so forth. So on this slide, what I've tried to do is just give you a very simplified view of what might happen. And I guess the key observation here is that some of these tariffs are really high. So particularly if you look at the right-hand side of the chart for sort of livestock type products, the tariffs for product going into the EU from outside are significantly high. And the UK position in the new set of tariffs it announced back in May is largely to mirror the EU tariffs. This is a big change to where we were heading towards the previous Brexit deadlines, when the UK government came out with a set of tariffs which were actually significantly lower than the EU's. but there's been a bit of a change in approach. So now as we head towards the 1st of January, we expect the UK government to apply a set of tariffs which are pretty close to what the EU would apply. And as you can see on some products, they're really high. They tend to be lower for plant-based products and for vegetables, around the sort of 5 to 15% range, than for livestock products. And obviously, if we were trading with these tariffs in place, it would add a significant cost to our exports of product to the EU. But the flip side is any EU product coming into the UK would be significantly higher in cost because they would incur this tariff as well. And we have done some analysis to kind of understand what the impact this would have on the market, which we'll look at in a couple of slides' time. But yeah, here it's worth flagging. There's been a number of studies done over the last few years looking at what the impact of this will be. And AHDB are one of the parties that have done a study, so you can look at this on our website, but there are other studies available as well. And all these studies have been done in slightly different ways, using slightly different economic models, but they've all come up with broadly similar findings, which is kind of reassuring in many ways, because if you triangulate using different approaches and come up with a similar answer, we can be pretty sure that the answer is going to be correct. So if we look at this on the next slide, you can see broadly, and this is again a bit of a simplification, but if there is a free trade deal with the EU, what we would expect is there would be relatively small changes to prices and to farms' income. That's because there will be some trade friction in the system, which will add a little bit of cost to imports and to our exports, but it's kind of a small change, as we'll see in a moment. If we do not have a deal and we trade under these WTO terms, basically the price movements are much, much larger, as we'll see in a second. And a really fundamental point here, that the key to understanding how this will impact your business is to understand what the sort of trade flow direction is between ourselves and the EU in the product which you're producing. So generally what happens if we're a net importer of a product, if there are tariffs in place, the tariffs basically make those imports much more expensive and prices will rise on our domestic market. Now, the flip side is if we're a net exporter of a product, those exports suddenly have a big tariff on them. It costs, it's harder for us to access the EU market. Potentially, we get a greater supply of commodity on our domestic market as a result, and prices are expected to fall. So if I just perhaps take you through some of the findings we have looking at this and how it might affect. So if we start with this free trade agreement option, so if there is a deal, the figures here kind of show, then these aren't a forecast of what we expect to happen to the price of these commodities to January. What these figures show is kind of the Brexit effect, the EU exit effect, all other things remaining equal. So you can see here that actually the price changes we would expect for the commodities highlighted are relatively modest. They're all less than 5% price change. So you will probably notice this, but it won't be a huge change which we would expect in a deal. Obviously, there are falls for prices where we are a net exporter. So sheep meat's a really good example. We net export to the EU. That trade friction under a deal will push the price down a little bit. The second two columns here kind of show what would happen if tariffs were applied and we didn't have a deal. And there's two columns because I thought it was really important to highlight the difference between the old set of tariffs, which the government were proposing as we headed into the previous deadline, and this new set, which we've had since May of this year. And I guess there's probably quite a bit of good news here for farming, in that the new set of tariffs are much higher, and you can see that has a positive effect on prices on our domestic market. So some of these price changes here are really quite positive. So for beef, we're expecting prices could rise by around 20%. For pig meat, not far short of that, and also for potatoes. The big at-risk sectors would be those sectors where we net export. So sheep meat is a really good example here. We export around 1/3 of our sheep meat to the EU each year. Barley is another net exporting sector, and it's in those areas where we would expect prices to fall most dramatically. It's probably worth caveating this information before everyone rushes out and buys a new tractor, because these are figures based on this set of tariffs which the government has outlined. Now, there's nothing kind of set in stone with those tariffs, and the government does have control. It's made a big play about having control over things like this going forward. So it's possible the government might decide, if food prices were to start shooting up, they may decide, well, actually, food prices going up politically isn't a good thing for us. Maybe we need to reduce some of these tariffs. So there's nothing sort of set in stone with these tariffs, and it's important everyone realises that. The other issue is that we do know that the government is in negotiations with a range of countries around the world about future free trade agreements. And what we haven't been able to do is factor in what those future free trade agreements might look like and what their impact might be. But they will have an impact. So as we look at the next slide, we know that at the minute there's 3 countries where the UK government is in advanced talks around a future trade deal. So the US, Australia and New Zealand. The figures here are the value of UK food and agricultural exports to each of those countries in 2019. So these are quite big trading partners for us, particularly the US. The US is our biggest single trade partner in terms of country level, at least in terms of trade of agricultural products. So these are really important countries which we trade with at the minute, but potentially if our tariff situation and a more favourable deal is struck with these countries, we could well expect trade to increase with these countries. This is something which we are looking at AHDB and trying to understand how those trade flows might affect our market. But as we don't know exactly what these deals look like or might look like yet, that isn't factored into the figures we showed earlier. But it's certainly something worth bearing in mind and thinking about going forward. So I'll just finish with a few conclusions for you. So hopefully one of my key messages here is that change is coming. So we saw that there will be price movements in the marketplace if there's a deal and also if there isn't a deal. But clearly a no deal outcome will result in the largest price changes, and we will see some movement in the markets as a result of that. Now, I think as we saw, some of those movements could well be positive for certain sectors of agriculture, but I would treat those findings with a bit of a pinch of salt, because it's nothing set in stone here, and it's possible that things could change. Not least, the government is in discussions with the US and other key trading partners, and indeed, those deals could see more product coming onto the domestic market, which will affect the results I showed you earlier. One of the things we've been asked to focus on today is to really highlight the things which you guys can do and steps you need to take to prepare. So for me, there's a couple of key things here in this area. Obviously, you can't control what's going to happen on the marketplace, but it's really important you understand what's happening and kind of have a feel for how you will be affected. And understanding those trade flows, I think, is really key in that. So at AHDB, we do have quite a comprehensive market intelligence service. So you can go onto our website and you can see a lot of information about prices and markets. And indeed, you can sign up to regular updates. So hopefully those services might be useful to you in keeping you abreast of what's going on. The second tip I've put in is really to talk to people within your supply chain. So be it your marketing group, your processor, suppliers, customers. I think really important at this time that everybody does talk about EU exit and what it might mean and the potential risks, so you are prepared for whatever might happen going forward. And that's me. Thank you, Phil.
Thanks, David. Quick question before we move on. We've heard and read a lot about the prospect of a US-UK trade deal, particularly how it impacts on agriculture. How does the outcome of the US election result, subject to any legal challenge, of course, how does that change things?
Yeah, good question, Phil. I think, I mean, a potential US trade deal would be a big thing for UK agriculture. The US is a very big trading partner for us, and I mean, not only for imports, but also quite a key export market, as the figure I showed earlier. I guess that's a really high political priority domestically for the UK government. I guess the thing which might have changed with the US election result is where it sits on the priority with the US administration. So certainly Donald Trump was very keen on trade, wasn't he, and opening up markets, and yeah, I think for him maybe it might have happened a little bit quicker than with a Joe Biden in charge, but I still think a deal will happen, but maybe a deal might be a bit longer before it's struck.
Thanks, David. I guess the US farm lobby still remains important, and they're trying to push for increased opportunities. Just a reminder before we move on that you can ask questions as we go along in the chat. I know there's quite a few questions coming in. I'm also aware that we had a couple of technical issues at the start for some folks. So just a reminder that in the handout section, you can access some of the useful resources and links to some of the things we're talking about today, so you don't have to be frantically scribbling things down. We will also be sending that handout out, as well as the links to the recording of the webinar that will land in inboxes tomorrow. So apologies for those that have suffered technical issues, but hopefully all the content is still there, and please keep the questions coming in. We're gonna move on now to Mark Topliff. A lot of the focus on the impacts of leaving the EU has probably focused on commodities and markets, but what about the supplies and availability of inputs? Mark's going to say a little bit about that. Mark is lead analyst in our farm economics team. So Mark, over to you.
Thanks, Phil. I'm going to cover the key inputs of fertilizer, plant protection products, seeds, animal medicine, and feed. And we'll go through the tariff rates and supply situation, and then what will influence the input prices, and finally advice on you as farmers and growers what you can do. The next 10 minutes just intended to give you an overview and a heads up on the situation. And I'm sure you appreciate the farm inputs is a big area and contains many sort of nuances with a huge number of products that are sold on the UK market. So moving on to what those tariff rates are. Let's start with fertilizers. Now, despite the fact that UK does have some domestic production capacity, it does still import most of its fertilizer requirements from either the EU or countries such as Morocco, Algeria, or Egypt. So for products like the urea, ammonium nitrate, ammonium nitrate products, the tariff rate will move from 6.5% to 6%, and for the other products, it will move to about 2%. Now, the existing domestic framework, which allows fertilizers to be sold in the UK, will remain in place because it's separate from the EU framework. But to ensure continued supply, the UK government has put in place a time-limited period during which EC fertilizer can be placed on the UK market as it is now. All fertilizers currently marketed in the UK can continue to be imported and marketed in the UK, provided they meet the government requirements. Moving on to plant protection products, we again import the majority of our plant protection products that are used in the UK, and these predominantly enter via what we call the short straits, the Dover-Calais route. Unless there's a trade deal that says otherwise, EU imports would currently be subject to a standard 6% tariff rate. All current active substance approvals, plant protection product authorisations would remain valid in the UK, so businesses would continue to trade and products would still be available. Next, seeds. Only imported barley and oat seeds would attract a tariff, with this being an additional sort of £77 per tonne and £74 a tonne respectively. However, any seed treatments would attract a tariff of 6%. Now, the main food and feed crop varieties marketed in the UK will need to be on the GB or Northern Ireland national variety list in order to be marketed, and any seed and propagating material originating from outside the UK would need to comply with sort of normal international requirements. On to veterinary medicines. Again, most of the medicines used in the UK are imported, again via the short straits route. However, some good news, there is currently no tariffs applied to animal medicines. To ensure continuity of supply, the UK would, for time limited period as well, continue to accept batch testing of veterinary medicines carried out in the EU, the European Economic Area, or any third countries with whom the EU has arrangements. Any veterinary medicines imported into the UK from any other third country would continue to require batch testing in the UK and certification, except where third countries and the EU have made appropriate arrangements with each other. And then finally, animal feed. Again, some good news in the fact that animal feed imports currently have 0% tariff rates, except for two feeds, prairie meal, £267 a tonne, and wheat brands with attractive tariff of £36 per tonne. Import controls will be risk-based in the event of no deal. No new controls are planned for imports from the EU of animal feed categorised as high risk, because the risk doesn't change on day one. High risk feed is products of animal origin and some specified products that are not animal origin. Border checks are currently made on high risk food and feed from third countries, and there's like to be an increase in physical checks on the import of food and feed from countries. Shipments from further afield, a new notification system is being developed because the UK no longer have access to EU import control. So high risk feed imported from third countries via the EU will be checked on entry to the UK at a designated port of entry. That's just a summary of the tariff rates in terms of those key inputs. Moving on then to what I think is probably a question that maybe many farmers and growers will be asking is, how is that going to impact the input prices and at farm level? Short answer is it's difficult to say, and there's four main reasons for this. Firstly, we don't have a trade deal with the EU yet, and so whether those tariffs will be implemented or applied, and that's going to be a big thing. But clearly, if they do get subjected to those tariffs, there's no doubt there'll be some passing on of that cost to the farm level. We don't know what the details around the arrangements of border controls are. Some have been sorted out, others are still being sorted out, and hence the amount of administration, friction, and the cost that might be involved is uncertain in some cases. And so again, it provides a little bit of uncertainty around the impact on the cost. Delays at ports. Should the new border controls slow down the passage of imports through the ports, it is another factor. Generally speaking, bulk imports such as fertiliser and feed are expected to experience less delays than the imports coming through the short straits, which potentially could be a bottleneck. So if there is delays which go on for a period of time, this is obviously going to affect the supply logistics and add cost into that supply chain. And last and certainly not least, exchange rate could have an impact, depending on the reaction of the money markets to the situation come the 1st of January. And we shouldn't underestimate the impact that might have, and certainly those products which we obviously need to import, that could be a sort of factor in terms of the price that we'll have to pay at farm level. Despite this, it may be useful just to put into context the current trends in key inputs. So if you just go back a slide. The chart on the right, on the left, sorry, is drawn from published figures showing the trend as an index in some key input prices to August of this year. Over the last 12 months, we've seen some key input prices change relatively little, while others have shifted quite significantly. For example, the loss of the cheaper fungicide and herbicide products from the market have left the more expensive products available for use on farm. In contrast, we've seen fertiliser prices have been low this year because of nitrate prices dropping, and there was also weaker demand for the product and lower production costs due to lower gas prices than last year. However, in reversal of those factors, we are seeing fertiliser prices increasing of late. Seed and feed prices haven't changed as much as the other inputs, but we are seeing, and reports are, an increase in these prices in recent weeks. And just in addition to those other inputs, I've shown fuel prices here, which also took a dive in 2020 with reduced demand due mainly to the COVID-19 pandemic. driving down the crude oil pricing, and so influenced the red diesel prices. Unfortunately, there wasn't any figures on animal medicine products available through this source. So what advice would we give to levy payers? Well, firstly, as far as practically possible, and some of you are probably already doing this as a matter of course, but really it's just to confirm what inputs you might need over the coming months as far as you can tell. Obviously, there's some inputs which you don't know until near the time whether you need to use them or not, but certainly as far as you can, try and sort of list down what you might need in the coming months. Second, and probably the most obvious and probably one of the most critical ones, and has already been mentioned already by David, is speak to those suppliers of those inputs. They will have an idea of what the supply situation might be, what any disruption or volatility there might be in the supply of those inputs. So certainly speak to those suppliers, and thirdly, maintain contact with them. Things will change, the situation may change, and it's probably quite crucial to make sure that you keep up to date with how those inputs that you've planned to use will be available in the coming months. And then finally, two very sort of livestock specific bits of advice. Those that have been advised to maybe stockpile some feed, if you're going to be using obviously storage which you wouldn't normally use for feed, just make sure that they'll meet any sort of assurance scheme requirements that you're a party to, and make any sort of changes to feeding regime according with your feed advisor. And lastly, there, in terms of the planning work, use your herd or flock health plans as a way to look at what you may need, and then talk to your prescribers, whether that's your vet or whoever, to then talk through making sure that those sort of medicines will be available, okay, in the coming months. Overall, plan, but please don't panic. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. There's some questions coming in on the chat, so we'll pick those up after we've heard from our next couple of speakers. But we're going to keep moving. Our next speaker is Sam Charlton. Sam's the knowledge exchange manager with our beef and lamb team, and Sam's going to look in a little bit more detail at farm finance. I'm conscious that there's an awful lot of uncertainty, but just what can we do? What's in our power to get ahead of the curve? Apologies in advance. The technical problems we had at the start aren't the only issue we've had today, so you'll be able to hear Sam, but you won't be able to see her, I'm afraid. Sam, over to you.
Thanks, Phil. Thank you for that. Yes, as Phil mentioned, I do currently work within the beef and lamb team. Previously, also had a role as a bank manager for farming clients across the north of England, if you haven't already picked that up from the accent. So today I'm just going to spend a little bit of time talking to you about some of the things that I learned in that role, and also how AHDB are developing their current business tools to help farms get ahead of the curve, as it were. So just an illustration that you probably all seen or are aware of already, is this what looks like a bit of a roller coaster when we experience change. The reason I put it up there is because it's particularly important when we consider farm finance, in that it can take an awful lot of time to get it right, and it certainly has a massive impact on performance. In an ideal world, we would just draw a straight line from the inception of change and get straight on with the job, moving probably what some of us may be doing, sitting with our heads in the sand, to what can we actually do about this. So a bit of shift in direction in this section of the presentation, and that we've discussed a lot of external factors, but hopefully we can chat about some of those internal factors and what we might be able to do about it. So just moving on then. Already mentioned, farm finance is such a huge area of discussion. Could take up a webinar all by itself. But if we look at this in three separate sections, it all starts with the why. Why is this change happening? Why is it important? And what actions might I need to take? Don't underestimate really narrowing that down in the first instance. There's some assumptions there on why it might be important to your business, but it's certainly going to be different for everybody. And there are obviously many things missing from that list as well. It may be that you are looking to purchase additional assets. It may be that you're looking to restructure finance. There could be a whole host of reasons as to why. The second bit is more around the how, and certainly through working in the bank, one of the things that we always recommended was to look at the farm business as much as possible as a business, and not as not take things too personally. It can sometimes feel like a criticism of the way things have been done. So try as much as possible to look at the business as a commercial entity. Clients would often ask me about or indeed list the many external factors that affect a farm business, and assume that all farm businesses were trading in the same manner with the same P&L. The actual truth is that as a bank manager, we've seen a huge variety of performance across different trading accounts, and the answer was always received with a raised eyebrow, but I can tell you that it is the truth, which to me tells me that there are an awful lot of things that business operators can do to take back control in terms of how their business performs, and we're going to talk in more detail about that shortly. The final bucket, if you like, is the who. Again, not to be underestimated, but it never ceases to amaze me the huge breadth of skills that our operators have when they're running farm businesses. We could develop a national profile that would really showcase that, but human nature sometimes prevails, and we inevitably do things that we enjoy best. So in every successful business, there's always a highly successful team around it. So take some time to pick yours, and if somebody else can do the job better, then by all means use their skills as well. So if you move on to the why first, and have a quick look at this, as I've already suggested, this isn't a question that I can answer for you, but there's a 5-point checklist here as to which parts of that you can move through. The first part is around define your purpose. Going back to that question of why you're doing what you're doing and what impact this change is going to have. Every credit application starts with purpose, so take some time to understand it. List what you want to achieve in tandem with what you need to achieve. Reality often sits in between those two goals, as it were, but they are separate, and both are equally as important as one another. And always a good point is when you're sitting through this planning stage is to look at it within the short, medium and long terms, and I've specifically listed the years within that as well. I think undoubtedly when you move through points 3 to 4, you will at some point come across the question around income, finances within the business. And this is the bit where I plug that forward planning and cash flow forecasting. So love it or hate it, this system of budget and forecasting is a game changer. And in every instance through my time working as a bank manager, there was always positive results. So I dare say there isn't a successful commercial company operating now that doesn't do so without some kind of system of budgeting and forward planning. So please take the time to do that if you're not doing so already. And don't forget that all parties that are involved in the business must be on board. They may not necessarily be listed as partners in the business or directors, but if the future of this business impacts them, I think it's important that everybody's in tune with each other. So if we move on to the how, this is the part where perhaps we could start offering a little bit more support and advice more directly, starting with just these 5 key questions. And a question to the audience really is, can you answer these 5 questions confidently about your business? And if the answer is no, then the good news is that there is plenty of help and support to help you get those answers. And the other good news is that all of those answers are from things that you already have within the business. So we're not asking you to go out and get any additional information. All the answers can be found with information that you do already provide. So let's take a deeper look at some of those questions now and see and see what else we can offer. The first question, question 1, if we just move the slide on, Sarah, I don't know if that's, there we go. First question 1, do you know what profit your business needs to generate enough income to meet your drawings, interest and capital repayments, tax and investment requirements? So that essentially are the 4 elements of where your profit goes. But this is perhaps taking a little bit of a different approach. It's what they call a take a bottom up approach, where you do the calculation and then consider what profit is required. First of all, just to break even, so to meet the commitments that you currently have, and then ask yourself, is that enough now and in the future, dependent on the business goals and aspirations that we discussed there in step 1. Also, just to highlight as well that contrary to popular belief, drawings isn't a dirty word. So, you know, be honest about what you and your family require from the business. We do accept that farming does offer a fantastic way of life, but also that we do need to make a living. And don't dismiss investment. Don't tell yourself that, oh well, I'm not spending a penny for the next few years, because from experience that was very rarely the case. Farms do require a level of maintenance as a minimum. And really, when we look at that depreciation total every year, we should be using that as perhaps a savings account for future investment. Rarely does that happen, but when we do make those capital, or we do experience those capital costs, that money does need to come out of our profits. And remember that debt serviceability is key. So if you can get your head around this calculation, it will certainly help if you need to access funds in the future. It isn't about what we own and a list of those assets and their value. It is definitely about what we owe and how we can demonstrate comfortable repayment both now and in the future. If we stress test those payments, we need to ensure that we can meet them. So how do I spend my profit, or how does my business fund its losses? So a good tip on this is to consider what we term proportional analysis. The title is probably more complex than the actual exercise itself, which simply splits your profit and loss account into smaller chunks. So for example, rent and finance might make up 25% of your overall income or less. That massively varies, but it's up to you to decide whether or not you think that's too high, or if indeed it needs to change. So it's an exercise that allows you to focus the mind and steer you in the right direction in terms of which areas require a closer look. Another common question that I came across through working in the bank is, why am I showing a profit when my overdraft is either increasing or not improving in its position? And the quick answer to that is to make a really comprehensive list of all of your cash takers. So I've listed some of them on the screen there, but the best source of this information is through your bank statements. If you don't look at those in detail, then perhaps a good exercise is to just start doing, dare I say, a bank reconciliation. It's perhaps not as boring as you might think, but you can derive an awful lot of information from where your cash is moving from through just doing a really in-depth analysis of that. And do ask your bank if you require some additional detail on it as well. Don't forget to look at your regular payments. Make sure you exactly know how much those are and what you need each month to cover them. Certainly a huge part of where that cash moves to. And finally, accountants can prepare a flow of funds annual statement, an accountancy term perhaps, but if that's something that's of interest to you, then have a chat to your accountant about it, see if they can prepare one for you, but just make sure that they go through it with you. Another one on the how is, I encourage everybody to really consider management accounts. There's a list there of the clear differences, and after looking at that list, I know which one would provide the greater detail. So if management accounts isn't something that you've considered, I would highly recommend that you do. It's something that you can do now. It provides current information and provides information that really gives you the opportunity to make decisions in your business. Assets are important, they do serve a purpose, so take some time to understand what they are. If looking at the balance sheet on your accounts doesn't float your boat, then perhaps a good idea is to look at doing your own farmer's balance sheet. If anything, it might make you feel good about what assets are in and around the farm, but just consider what value you're gaining from those assets. Are you happy with the return that you receive from them? And is there any way that you could put them to better use? And a final check there is just around growth. When you're looking to grow the business, really take some time to understand how and why that happens. Growth can only come from cash, which in a lot of cases is derived from profits. In some instances, you may need to introduce capital either from the business or from personal funds, or you do need to borrow the money from the bank. So some real key considerations there. And the final part there on the 3 stages is who. So, you know, as I said there, we do things best when we enjoy doing them. So think about who you need to employ to help you with this, and remember that you can't always do it alone. Make sure that you think about your purpose and business ambitions and surround yourself with the people that you can trust in order to achieve them. And if you are paying for a service, make sure that you're gaining value from it and be confident to make a change if you're not. Ask others what they receive and what they like best about the service that they get from people that help them in terms of farm finance. Just remember that good people are often in demand, so be clear about what expectations that you have from them and what it is that they can deliver. And finally, ask others. They won't charge you for your opinion, and believe it or not, they won't monitor what you do with it either. Next slide, Sarah. So we have developed in our series of Horizon documents looking more specifically at the top performers, and this was done in conjunction with Anderson's. You can get a hard copy or download this from our website. And as it says, it focused on the top performers in our industry cross-sector and highlighted 8 key factors which have been listed here in ascending order. It probably comes as no surprise that minimising overheads was the #1 factor, and pleases me in the fact that it is something that we can, as I've just discussed, take some control over. If we look at the next slide, it breaks that down, and the top one there in terms of high performers is looking at the control of costs, that attention to detail and focusing on those key areas, which can be done through exercises such as the proportional analysis. And that flexibility and probably mindset was another key one. And just to finish, a quote of one of the findings that we found from that report, I think is really pertinent. Higher output accounts for just 10 to 30% of higher profits in top quartile farm businesses, but lower costs contribute to 65 to 90%. And again, that was cross-sector, so a really key point there. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. A lot in that. And just a reminder that links to some of the resources and questions are available in the handout. We're going to keep moving on. One of the questions that has already appeared in the chat was around access to labour, and I think it was Sergei Kaminsky that was asking about how do I get workers from the EU post January the 1st. So that question and a couple of others, I'm going to pass over to Tess Howe to pick up, and Tess is our final speaker this morning. Then we're going to open it up to some broader questions to take us through to 1:30. Tess, over to you.
Thank you very much, Phil. So what is going to change is the big question, and there still is quite a lot of variables and unknowns about what is happening, but we do know free movement from the EU is ending at the end of the year, and it will be replaced by a new points-based system, immigration system. And that means that all EU and non-EU citizens, so anybody outside of the UK, will all be treated on an equal footing now when they come in from a labour perspective. And then we're going to be looking at job, salary and language requirements when we bring people in through. There's various different routes of bringing people in, but the one we're going to look at today is the skilled worker route. And so just a few deadlines and dates to point out to people. anybody that's got EU citizens and their family members now, if they're living in the UK now, they can apply for EU settlement scheme, which means that the points-based immigration system then doesn't apply to them because they will have got settlement status. So they've got to move over here before the 31st of December. From the 1st of January, when the free movement stops, you will need to be a licensed sponsor to hire anybody in from outside of the UK, regardless of where they're coming from. And we'll talk about that shortly on the next slide. And then the 30th of June is the actual application deadline for those people that are eligible for that settlement status to get that themselves. So we move on. So what does that actually mean to you? So if you're not recruiting labour directly from abroad, you might be sat there thinking, well, that doesn't really mean much to me. And that could be true, strictly speaking. But what we do need to understand is that this change does really mean that the labour market that we're typically used to having and as the industry's relied on as a whole is going to tighten up quite significantly. So there could be knock-on effects to the availability of labour and what some people have already been starting to see, the quality of that labour that's coming through as well. But if you are recruiting, there is new things that you've got to do. So either becoming a licensed sponsor or working through a licensed sponsor, so through an agency. And it's important to remember that becoming a licensed sponsor, it will depend on the kind of roles that you're recruiting for, because not all will be eligible to come through, and it will also depend on your business. And it's worth checking the .gov website to check whether your business would be eligible, because there's so many different structures. We can't really give that information on this webinar. But what it does mean is that although it now means we've got access to the whole world, it means that there's minimum requirements on those people that will gain a visa. And these minimum requirements are looking at A-level equivalent in terms of skills, a minimum salary threshold, and that'll be one of either £25,600 or the going rate for that job. So if a job is typically advertised at 50,000, that would be the threshold for that particular role. Now, there is some scope for people to come in on a lower salary, but they would have to be in the shortage occupation list. And the bad news for us there is that there's very few agriculture and horticulture jobs on that occupation list as it currently stands. And I know there is people in the industry looking at changing that list, but at the moment we don't feature highly on it. So that can be a problem for us going forward. There's also going to be English language requirements as well for people coming in. And those people that are employing labour from overseas, there will also be a immigration skills charge, which will be £1,000 for anybody coming through the skilled worker route for the first year, and then £500 every 6 months for that subsequent 6-month period that they're involved with on the business. So will my labour force be affected? And we can see here there's a list of different jobs that really covers quite a broad spectrum of what we're doing in the industry. And we know that migrant labour has played a critical role in the workforce over the past decade or so. And the chances are that most roles are going to be affected. This list comes from the response from the NFU when they did a membership survey and asked people what they thought the shortage of roles was going to be in the future. This list is people where there was at least 50% of the respondents saying they felt there was a shortage in this area. So we can see there's really not a lot of room for complacency or comfort with that list. If we can move on. What does it actually mean? Well, there's threats and opportunities. And what we can see from a threat, we've got a smaller pool of people with an appropriate skill set, which obviously makes it more difficult to recruit people. That then can impact the way that we're working with the existing workforce, with our family members, ourselves, start working longer hours. Jobs can get harder. That means it's more difficult to retain people sometimes. That can lead to a reduction in productivity and increased cost of productions. You might even see an increased sick leave and most importantly as well, accident rates rise when people are overworked and tired, etc. So there is quite a danger to us if we don't get the right skill set on our workforce. But as with most things, where there's a threat, there's an opportunity. And I mean, sadly, for the UK economy, unemployment is rising through the roof at the moment. And so there will be more British citizens needing jobs now. and that is a real opportunity that we need to think about and look for, taking the opportunity there. The other opportunity to look at really is, can we change the way we use our labour and the labour requirement that we actually have? Can we change the business in a way, restructure or look at different processes so that that labour requirement would actually change in itself? We can move on. And really the things that we can do now and help ourselves is really seizing that opportunity of becoming better recruiters when we do need new staff. And that cycle starts before we need those staff. So on here we've got build your brand, and that's not about building a brand to put on the supermarket shelf. That's you as a business, you as AB Farming. Do people understand what your company does? Do you have a social media presence or any kind of presence in the local area that people understand who you are and what you're doing? And have you got that reputation as an employer that people want to work for? And we've seen real shifts in people when they've started to look at how they look after their staff, and actually they become an employer of choice, and that reputation floods. And we've seen people go from being short and understaffed to actually having waiting lists of people wanting to come and work on their farm when they've sorted out their employment offering. And it really is about balancing what you want and what the job seeker wants. So we're going to have an open job market with people that are unemployed, but they will have certain restraints on the way that they can work as well. And we find that some people that don't have recruitment issues are a lot more flexible in the way they work with the people coming forward. And that's not always possible in agriculture. Livestock farming 7 days a week, arable farming can be long hours at certain periods, and when the job needs doing, the job needs doing. But there is times when we can be more flexible, and we need to think about that when we're looking to recruit people. The other element is looking at the attitude of people, not just the aptitude that they've got. You could have somebody with the best skill set in the world, but if they've got no motivation, they're not really going to contribute to the business as best as you could. You bring somebody in with the right attitude, and if you as the employer also have that right attitude to train and develop those people, then actually you could gain a lot more out of them than just thinking, I need to get that next person with exactly the same skill set as the person that's left. And look for transferable skills. If we're bringing in people that haven't worked in the industry, they're not going to be able to do everything from the first day, but look at what they can bring to the business and how they can help you. And they could have different ideas, different ways of looking at things, which could really help the business in the long term. And then from a retention point of view, what we're really looking at is do what you promise and keep that reputation up. So if you promise them they'd have every other weekend off, make sure they get every other weekend off. If you promise they tell them that they would finish at certain times, make sure that happens when it's within your gift to give them that. And I think one of the things is really understanding their needs and what their motivator is, and using that then to your advantage to make sure they work the best for your business. And people's motivators will change across different people, and even individuals will change their motivators. And it's not always about money. It could be about responsibility. It could be about a better work-life balance. There's lots of different things. And actually, we need to speak with those people and work out what those individual motivators are. And we have a lot more chance of keeping them in the business. And if they're a positive contributor to that business, that's really what we need to do when we're in this tight labour market. Also, understand people's priorities. People are there for different reasons. And you might realise that the combine needs to run till midnight because it's going to rain the next day. But for your worker, that might not be their key priority. And so it's understanding and how we can work and communicate with those people to make sure that we keep the good staff. But obviously, we're not all employees of a large number of people, and we do have family farms out there. And you might not use migrant labour, but in the same way, that might not impact you directly. This tightened market really could mean that the casual staff that you use here and there become a lot harder for you. And so now really, as it's already been said, it's time to plan what you need to do and how you're going to move forward, and communicate with the whole family about what your short-term and long-term plans are and where your ambitions and vision are. The amount of times we work with farms and two generations don't have the same objective for the business. So really have that communication, which means you can put that vision out there and those objectives, and you can really then start to plan and build the business that will take you to that objective. And it could be really looking at the business again and looking what does work, what doesn't work. Should you release some land? Should you take more land on? Could you look at utilising your skills in other businesses and taking that skills labour somewhere else and making your money that way around? So It can be hard thinking about these changes, and what we do see in businesses when they do that is actually using an independent person to help them review that business from a really objective point of view, and it's a lot easier having that eye from the outside come and tell you what options are available to you, and then you as a family working out those options and what suits for you. But the most important thing through all of this is that we really do need to look after our well-being. The likelihood is people will start working longer hours, thinking they can do it all themselves, and that only lasts so long before unfortunate accidents happen or people break down themselves. So I think what we wanted to leave you with before we go to the questions was just highlighting to you that there really is a big period of change. We've had a massive year in 2020 with everything that has happened with COVID, and now we're going into 2021 with the Brexit implications. And there is help available for each and everyone out there. There's a range of charities, and there's many more regional charities as well out there to support. This is just some of the national ones and their contact details, but they've all got amazing support programs in different areas, and if they can't help you themselves, they will know the right charity that can. So please do shout up and ask for that help, or just drop one of these leaflets in front of a friend of somebody else that you think might need some help, because they can make a big difference to people. And that's it. Thank you, Phil.
Thanks, Tess. I'm kind of really kind of glad that you mentioned there about there is so much uncertainty, and I think that's one of the things that jumps out from the last kind of hour or so is although we know quite a bit, there's still a lot of detail. There's still plenty that is up in the air. But what really jumps out for me is that the change is coming, and I think I said at the start that you know, it's making change in uncertain times is a real challenge, and in our industry it's natural to take that wait and see approach, particularly where we've got long production cycles. And I think in any situation, battening down the hatches and trying to ride out change is a sensible strategy. However, in this instance, there is so much changing, and it's not just about a blip. It's not just about riding out the storm. Actually, it feels like the best approach is thinking about how we adapt to that new normal, and there is a lot of uncertainty, I guess, there, but I think in the next few weeks much of that will start to come clear. We've got 15 minutes or so left. Quite a few questions have come in. I'll jump back to the speakers and run through as many of those as I can, but any that we don't get to, we will pick up in our frequently asked questions, and that will again be included in the information pack that accompanies today's webinar. So look, I'm going to kick off with Sarah's just appeared on my screen. So first question I'm going to pose to Sarah, and I think this was one from Russell Osborne asking about being perhaps somebody with a smaller farming business. His future strategy might be to rent out the farm. Question mark about, do I need to be an active farmer to benefit from future payments?
Okay, thank you, Russell. Good questions. So in terms of future payments, there will be two types of future payments. There will be your reducing direct payments. They don't stop you renting out the farm. They are area based, and they go to the owner. There will be an option for you to take the 7-year transition payment up front. Now, the details of that haven't been released yet, and I would suggest you keep very close to any announcement, but that might be an option for you to take that payment up front and then to rent out your farm. The new payments, the payments for public goods, my understanding, and although we're still lacking a bit of detail on this, is that they will be made available to land managers, and an action will be required in order to qualify for those payments, which is another reason why they're likely to be less generous, because there will be a cost incurred in taking that action, and therefore for those payments you would need to be an active land manager. So I hope that answers the question.
And I guess from my perspective, there's still a lot of uncertainty. Any scheme in future is going to come with a whole host of rules and regulations that accompany it. So just because we're moving out of Europe, we're having policy and schemes that will be relevant to the UK, doesn't mean we move away from some of the red tape that might have been associated with CAP in the past.
Yes, absolutely. I think during the, if we cast our minds back 4 years now, one of the things that was muttered at the time was, you know, a bonfire of regulations in an industry as complex as modern agriculture. That's extremely unlikely to happen. However well designed the schemes are going forward, there will be an element of red tape and bureaucracy and you know, checks and balances in order to ensure that it works efficiently and fairly.
Thanks, Sarah. Sam, a question for you that came up in the chat, and we've kind of touched on it around uncertainty, but you know, essentially budget planning. What's the point if there's so much uncertainty? I can guess your answer, but really interested to kind of see what your take is on that.
Yeah, Phil. Yeah, good question, and one that have been asked many times. I mean, there's two approaches with budgeting. Really, it's one, if there's an area of uncertainty that's imminent, you know, you have the choice, and there's a lot of other actions you can take first, hoping to get a more clear response on something that might have a big impact on budgeting, certainly with what the changes that we're waiting to hear on right now. But the really key thing with budgeting is not about getting the forecasting right. It's about comparison between your actual against your forecast, and what those differences is, because that'll help you sort of hone in on the areas of the business that may need some attention.
So I guess if things change your budgets. It's not a reason not to do them, I guess.
Yeah, and sometimes actually you don't necessarily need to change the budget, but if you're tracking your actual against your budget, then the difference will be obvious. And as long as there is a clear reason as to why that's different, that in itself can sometimes say an awful lot.
Thanks, Sam. Mark, just think about the inputs. So, I mean, some of the tariffs that you showed in the presentation, they tend to be lower than the tariffs that we see on kind of agricultural outputs, particularly on livestock products. I'm asking this for a friend. What's the tariff on tractors? Is my first question. Second one is, I guess, particularly when we think about some of the animal health type products and some of the big companies that are involved in the manufacture of those products, they're also the same companies that are at the forefront of developing COVID and vaccines. Any kind of supply hiccups on the horizon?
Well, I'll start with the first question, Phil. The tariffs on importing tractors is 0%, so there's nothing to pay on that. If you're importing tractors, the only thing you would need to sort of really pay is the VAT, but you can reclaim that if you're obviously VAT registered. Regards to those sort of big companies that the multinational companies that are producing these animal medicines, I mean that they're well set up, that they're well organised, really. They've had a bit of a I suppose a sort of run through when we had the threat of a sort of whether Brexit was going to happen or not, and so that contingency planning has largely been done. So I think from that point of view, they'll be well organised. They'll have stock available for a few months, for a few weeks, sorry, to keep supply going should there be any disruption. I think the main thing is the point of entry into the UK and whether that disrupts that sort of flow, and if most of that product sort of comes through the short straits, then potentially that is a bottleneck where we might see some disruption. If that disruption carries on for many weeks and months, then we may well then see some kind of supply issue, but that they'll have some supply in stock to meet any sort of shortfall in the logistics supply in the time being. So hopefully, and what I'm told from talking to contact industry is that there shouldn't, for most products, be much of an issue.
Thanks, Mark. I'll come on to some issues for David in a moment around kind of tariffs and trade, because that was when we did the survey at the start, that was one of the most popular areas. But there's a couple of things I just want to pick up with Tess on labour. Tess, a specific question about, can someone who lived and worked in the UK previously but is now back in the EU. Can they apply for settled status? That's one question. And another one, just I guess your view in terms of how well served do you think our industry is through our education and training establishments to make sure that agriculture and horticulture is flagged as a career? So hopefully a definitive question, but also one then where I want your opinion and views on.
For the first one, my understanding is they need to be living in the UK, but I would feel more comfortable checking that out and putting it in the FAQ. But from what I've read, it's them living in the UK now that makes them eligible for the settled status, or until the 31st of December. But we will definitely put that one into the FAQ. In terms of training and education, we have a lot of establishments out there providing really good education for agriculture. I think the problem we have is the perception of the industry, and therefore recruiting the right people that we need to drive the industry forward gets harder and harder, because it's seen as that industry that doesn't have progression or professionalism, and that's something that we're working on in AHDB, but also with a lot of external partners on really demonstrating to the influencers what opportunities we have in the industry, and then helping with the trailblazer apprenticeships, etc., to provide that education so it's really fit for purpose for industry. So there's room for improvement from a perception point of view, and I think we can all contribute to that. And then it's about really putting the right training in place for the industry. But there's lots of providers, good providers out there. It's just there's a little bit of a mismatch and fragmentation at the moment.
Thanks, Tess. David, I've got a few questions that I just want to finish off this session with, firing at you. So we'll get through as many of these as possible. First up, tariffs and paperwork. Do we really think they're going to be in place by January the 1st? Are we looking at potential blockages at ports of entry and exit?
Well, what, on tariffs, Phil, or paperwork, or both?
Both.
Okay, so
I suppose tariffs complicates it further, doesn't it? But particularly in terms of the flow of goods in and out.
Yeah, so basically, I think the UK government is taking a sort of a pragmatic approach in terms of the introduction of this sort of extra bureaucracy and checks and paperwork. And there will be paperwork, but it's going to happen in phases, I think. So certainly in terms of imports, I wouldn't expect any major problems. But if you are exporting products, the EU has been very clear that the kind of rules which it has are in place for everybody, and they'll be in place from January the 1st. So that will impact the industry in terms of products which we're exporting. Lamb's an obvious example, but any trade we've got going to the EU will need to have all of the correct paperwork and all the information in place. So there's lots of government advice out there for people involved with that trade. On our EU exit page, we've got a section which kind of goes through and signposts everyone to all the correct information they need. But it will look very different, I think, from January the 1st than it has done previously. Tariffs is slightly different. Tariffs will only apply if we don't get a deal. So if there isn't a trade deal, then tariffs will come in from January the 1st. And again, do you know what I mean? The EU has said that will apply from the 1st of January. I think it'd be hard for the UK to be importing stuff and not applying a tariff to it, but there may be a little bit of flex on stuff coming into the country, but certainly not on stuff going out of the country.
How big a challenge is it, or again, potential bottleneck, livestock products that are exported? They're going to require animal health certificate. So numbers of vets has been a bit of a talking point. Is that an issue for farmers, or is it for the red meat chain? Ultimately, it's going to impact on farmers, but
yeah, I guess lots of the actions which will need to be taken there are not for farmers. They're for other people in the supply chain. So up to now, there's been relatively free movement of product across the EU, and because we've been a member of the EU, the rules have been have been minimal. There's been relatively little requirement for paperwork and checks. But yeah, going forward, traders will need to be registered with an EORI number, for example. On livestock products, they will need a veterinary certificate, a health certificate. So there's a whole range of additional requirements. So the goods have to go via border inspection posts. So during the goods where the products are flowed, we need to be registered to trade those products. So there's a lot of sensitivity, I think, around the trade of livestock products in particular. So there's a lot of additional requirements and checks there. And people might listen and think, well, it's only a bit of paperwork. Actually, if for every load those bits of paperwork have to be done, those checks have to be done. If vets have to inspect product, that does all add cost. And you're right, Phil, there has been some concern around whether we even have enough vets in the country to deal with that. I do notice Tess referred to the sort of shortage occupation list earlier. Vets have been added to that list, so the government has done kind of what it can to ensure we do have a supply of vets. But I think it will be a challenging period for us going forward, particularly the first few months of this sort of new way of working.
So some of the questions that we had in earlier on when you were talking was about some of the figures that you shared, and particularly, I suppose, if I think about our current trade to the EU, it's from an agricultural perspective, what 75% of the value of our exports is to Europe. So any gap there potentially has some big impacts. But what's your take in terms of certainly that kind of potential for import substitution and changes in things like kind of carcass balance? Will our industry respond and do things differently?
I think it will, Phil. And I think it already has to some degree. So we have seen adjustments starting to happen in the run-up and in expectation of change in January. So, a few examples. We do import for potatoes a massive volume of frozen potato products and frozen chips. And we know of companies that have looked to invest more in their processing and their capacity to produce those products in the UK. We're seeing the same thing on the dairy side. So, for dairy, we import lots of soft cheese, and supply chains have made steps to start to make more of that product domestically. So we don't have to kind of export a product like a cheese, have it turned into soft cheese and sent back again. So I think some of that change has already happened. It's obviously difficult for the big companies and the people trading that product to make significant investments with all the uncertainty around it. So I would expect once we have that uncertainty, and if that uncertainty is a tariff barrier, you would expect there to be quite a bit of investment into those areas quite rapidly as we look to try to avoid those tariffs. The reality is the market will adjust to that new sort of regime over a period of time. So the sorts of price changes I highlighted, if the price of beef has gone up 22-23%, that provides quite a big incentive for the supply chain to domestically produce more beef. So the price of beef won't always be 22% higher. Farmers will respond to that, then start to produce more, and over time that price differential would drop back a little bit.
Okay. Thanks, David. Look, there's been loads of questions that have come in we haven't had a chance to get through this afternoon. I'm going to draw the meeting to a close there. Look, thanks again to our speakers. Really sorry for those folks that had a couple of technical issues early on. This definitely won't be the last time that we're talking about EU exit and its implications on agriculture. As more information becomes available, as more clarity emerges, we'll be sharing more. So look, we're going to pick up announcements and implications in our market intelligence publications. So if you're one of the 44,000 subscribers to those publications, you'll get that landing in your inbox. If you're not, get in touch with us and we'll sign you up. We're also going to revisit these issues in future webinars and briefings. A reminder that you can view what's coming up, sign up for future events at ahdb.org.uk/events. Many thanks for joining us today. I think we crammed an awful lot from our 5 speakers, looking at those areas around policy, around markets and trade, around inputs and supplies, some of the finance issues and some of the labour issues. We've crammed a lot into the last 90 minutes. Thanks again. If you could complete the feedback survey form that will appear on your screen at the end of the webinar, that would be fantastic. That information all helps us to improve what we do and what we offer to you guys going forward. The recording of this will be available and will be sent to you in 24 hours. Also be available on the AHDB webpage and on our YouTube channel. So thanks again for joining us. If there's any further questions you've got, keep them coming into AHDB, and we will, let's say, pick up any issues, any questions in the FAQs that we update after this webinar. Many thanks. Bye-bye.